Animals don't go through revolutionary changes that fundamentally reshape their social structures. They also lack the concept of progress, deliberate, goal-oriented development. For most of our species' history, we weren't much different. Living as hunters and gatherers, small tribes were bound by certain technological and social traditions. The life of a Paleolithic hunter was almost identical to that of their ancestors 10 or even hundreds of generations earlier. Spears and teamwork may have made humans arguably the most efficient predators, but we were still firmly part of the natural world. The true turning point in history was the Neolithic period. As you might have noticed, I often bring up this era in videos on various topics, because the Neolithic Revolution laid the foundation for all modern civilization. Humanity transitioned from hunting and gathering, or as some like to call it, plundering nature, to creative, productive labor, growing crops and domesticating animals. Although to me it seems less about lofty ideas and more about moving from plunder, which all living beings do, to exploitation. Still, after diving into the major theories explaining the Neolithic Revolution, I've realized that my own understanding of this event was outdated and no longer fits the evidence. That said, I won't point fingers, but it turns out that among many popular history bloggers, similarly outdated views still prevail. Yet understanding the reasons behind the Neolithic Revolution is the key to all subsequent societal transformations. And to start, we should debunk a common myth that mammoths and other megafauna went extinct, causing a hunting crisis and forcing humans to find new food sources. This idea applies to large parts of Eurasia, where the loss of animals pushed humans to rely more on river resources. Mesolithic sites often reveal literal mountains of freshwater mussel shells. However, agriculture and animal domestication first emerged in the Near East. If we examine the Kabaran culture, which existed around 8,000 years before the Neolithic, or the later Natufian culture, which likely made the first leap to food production, an intriguing fact emerges. The main hunting target, both during the Ice Age and later, about 12,000 years ago in the modern Holocene interglacial period, was the gazelle. Unlike the mammoth fauna, it didn't go extinct. By the way, saying the Ice Age ended 12,000 years ago isn't entirely accurate. We simply entered another warm, interglacial period, which will eventually come to an end. Meanwhile, in Europe, where hunters of mammoth fauna roamed, hunting and gathering remained the only sources of food for roughly 4,000 years after agriculture appeared in the Near East. At first glance, Gordon Child's oasis theory seems plausible in explaining the Neolithic transition. According to it, the Middle Eastern climate became drier during the interglacial period, forcing people to cluster in oases, where limited resources drove the development of agriculture. I haven't delved deeply into Middle Eastern climate studies, but I've come across research that doesn't support a direct overlap between the dry period and the advent of agriculture. Speaking of farming and livestock, many people make the classic mistake of assuming it was a unique breakthrough that spread across the globe. However, if we look at China, sites like Kwahukiao and others show evidence of rice cultivation over 1,000 years before Near Eastern farming practices reached the Balkans and the Caucasus. In India, some suggest agriculture may have emerged simultaneously with the Middle East. Then there are the islanders of New Guinea, who independently began cultivating local crops about 7,000 years ago in a modern climate. And of course, the Native Americans, who had no connection with the Middle East, India, or China. Today, researchers identify at least 8 independent centers where agriculture arose globally. Each had vastly different climates, and none were affected by the extinction of mammoth fauna. In my opinion, the researcher who came closest to uncovering the true causes of the Neolithic Revolution was Dr. Carl Sauer, the founder of modern cultural geography. According to his demographic theory, a tribe would settle in a resource-rich area abundant in wild grains, berries, fish, and game. Such an environment would allow the population to grow significantly until they hit a limit. When resources could no longer support the expanded population or environmental changes occurred, crises followed. Simply put, people don't innovate when life is easy and abundant. Equatorial tribes living in resource-rich regions, for example, never transitioned to agriculture. Why? Because this shift requires 2 things: a growing population and a crisis. It's naive to think that Stone Age humans, who had brains essentially the same as ours, didn't understand that plants grow from seeds or that animals could be domesticated. But hunting, fishing, and gathering aren't as labor-intensive and repetitive as farming. Wherever nature provided, people lived off the land, practicing a subsistence lifestyle as long as possible. Some groups even practice it today, despite centuries of contact with farming communities. Agriculture and herding weren't miraculous discoveries. They were desperate measures, adopted only when survival left no other choice. The transition also required breaking millennia of ancestral traditions, something societies tend to resist. Overpopulation and crisis are the primary drivers of social and economic transformation. Here's a more recent example. In the late Middle Ages, there was a small island nation about the size of a mid-sized European region, with a population of 4 million. Surprisingly, its population density was higher than that of modern Sweden or Estonia. But as an island state, its resources were depleted, and forests were nearly wiped out. The 16th century brought soaring grain prices and famine riots, and the following century ushered in civil war and revolution. It seemed like the worst-case scenario, an enormous population, for the time, stuck on limited land with scarce resources. But humans are wired to find solutions in the face of hardship, and overcoming those challenges brings a certain satisfaction. This principle even underpins the modern gaming industry. The solution came in the form of legalized piracy, privateering, and the search for new lands rich in resources, often inhabited by societies deemed less developed. This process, later known as colonization, led to a historic transformation. In no time, historically speaking, this agrarian state not only survived but became the largest empire the world had ever seen. Yes, we're talking about England and the British Empire. The British Empire, famously known as the empire on which the sun never set, became the economic and technological leader of its time. Modern capitalism, as we know it, followed the path it carved. Those who failed to adapt to this new economic model often became dependent on those who succeeded. Many of today's wealthiest nations built their prosperity on colonies. A significant portion of former colonies evolved into what can be called comprador states, dependent capitalist countries serving as raw material suppliers. Speaking of crises, take island nations like Japan. While it avoided colonization, it faced forced trade, recognized its technological lag, and, through the Meiji Restoration, made a leap forward. Similarly, the Russian Empire's revolutions and subsequent industrialization were preceded by crises and technological backwardness. Fun fact, Britain's timber shortage led to a groundbreaking discovery: coal. They learned to heat coal without oxygen, producing coke. In the early 18th century, Abraham Darby invented the coke-fueled blast furnace, finally enabling the mass production of affordable metal, fulfilling a long-held dream. Speaking of industrial development, in the 19th century, a British entrepreneur, John Hughes, developed the coal seams and metallurgical industry in Donbass. The Russian Empire gave him land and resources for free, later purchasing his finished goods. The workers' settlement, named after him, Husovka, eventually became the city of Donetsk. When it comes to crises, there's a Roman legend worth mentioning. In the days of King Romulus, neighboring tribes looked down on the Romans, calling them a band of impoverished drifters. This led to a shortage of women. To solve this, the Romans hosted a festival inviting nearby tribes. While their guests were distracted, the Romans attacked, killing the men and capturing the women. This solved their demographic problem while weakening local competition. History books may present authority with reverence, but the line between power and crime is often blurry. Still, it's naive to label authority as pure evil. Just as spiders spin webs and birds build nests, humans across the globe naturally developed hierarchies. I'm not talking about ancient stone pyramids, but complex social hierarchies that arose with agriculture, high population densities, and the emergence of civilization. Thinking about humanity, I found an analogy. In the sci-fi series The Expanse, there's a protomolecule that, in small amounts, turns matter into something grotesque and chaotic. But given enough material, it forms purposeful, structured systems. Similarly, as humanity's density and crises grow, we transform into more complex systems, unlocking new potential. I believe it's not individuals, but circumstances that drive history. And much like any living organism, human society has an internal blueprint guiding its evolution. While the timing and location of discoveries or events may vary, since the moment we first picked up tools, our trajectory has been predetermined. On today's topic, let's talk about leftist revolutions, seen by some as the next stage after capitalism. Yet the Soviet Union collapsed, leaving capitalist states in its wake. China reformed, embraced openness, and essentially became capitalist, boasting greater wealth inequality than many Western nations, which is ironic for socialism. But China's murder and incarceration rates are over 10 times lower than those in America. Meanwhile, North Korea abandoned most leftist ideologies in favor of Juche, a system resembling an ultra-hierarchical monarchy. All this suggests that successful revolutions require more than just revolutionaries. They demand economic and political circumstances and a certain level of technological development. At the time of leftist revolutions, capitalism was far from obsolete. Even now, it remains viable. Many experts predict 21st century crises: demographic, economic, and energy. Understandably, these fears resonate with people. But it's crises, not stability, that drive human progress. They push us forward. Will the future bring communism or something we can't yet imagine? It's hard to say. But revolutionary changes, though rare, are inevitable. And let's remember that revolutions mean profound transformations, not just a shift in political power. Living in times of change may not be pleasant, but what's painful for one generation often benefits the next. That said, it's naive to think every new era is categorically better than the last. Each has its spirit, strengths, and flaws. Let me finish with two quotes, one from a renowned writer and the other from a little-known archaeologist. Human history doesn't end with the roar of cosmic catastrophes, the blaze of nuclear wars, or the grip of overpopulation. It ends in the serene quiet of abundance. Hardship and adversity aren't paths to extinction. They're the only way to a life worth living.